whether you've been doing it for 30 years or you're just starting, there's probably some lessons in there that will be helpful. And I like to think of it as a field guide.
Hello everyone, my name is Eduardo Martins and this is AgilityTalks. And today I have a special guest. It's Kiron Bondale, and he's a long-standing contributor of Project Management Institute. He holds a bunch of certification in the Agile space, and he has a lot of years in experience in the field, and more recently he published a book sharing all of these lessons learned throughout the years that is easy in theory, difficult in practice. So welcome, Kiron.
Thank you, Eduardo. I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you. It's a pleasure to have such great people sharing with us here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So as we talked before, the idea of this show is actually to relate the values that are proposed in the Alma Framework with the lessons that you are proposing on your book. And I know we have a bunch of them, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what's interesting is you might notice that I've got Homer Simpson and Dilbert to the side of me here. And these are actually very symbolic. They represent the angel and the devil of project management or project delivery.
Here we go. This is fantastic.
In every project manager, in every scrum master, there's a little of Homer Simpson and there's a little of Dilbert. And I've tried to capture some of the lessons from both in this book that I wrote.
No, this is great. Here's your book, Is Interior Difficult in Practice. I believe it's in Amazon for everyone to buy, Kiron.
Absolutely. It's available Amazon, Indigo Chapters, Barnes & Noble in both paperback and ebook formats. It's very reasonably priced. So definitely it's useful for anybody that is in leading initiatives. Whether you've been doing it for 30 years or you're just starting, there's probably some lessons in there that will be helpful. And I like to think of it as a field guide. I mean, it's great if you want to read it cover to cover, but I find it's very useful to carry it around with you. And when you find yourself in a particular situation, look through the table of contents and you might find an article that fits the situation you're in. And you can use it as a live field guide to help you get better at leading projects.
No, this is great. So when you say 100 lessons, you actually organize that like situation by situation. So it really can serve as a guide. This is
Absolutely.
great.
Absolutely. There's categories for each of the articles, and it is very easy to be able to find an article that might be a fit for the situation that you find yourself in.
That's great. That's great, Kiron. The way that I propose the Alma framework actually comes from the observation for the teams that I worked throughout my career too, that they were in need of much more profound transformations than the method that they were using. So regardless the method that they were using, we're talking about Kanban, we're talking about Scrum, or whatever, they're reaching kind of the capacity of the framework, and they needed much more profound transformations. I actually call that moment like the agile limbo, where you use a prescribed framework and iteration after iteration things do not improve. You see low motivation and low engagement. So the issue is not in the method. And I propose some key agile values that you need to work with your teams. And for being able to do it, you need to ask the right questions. And it always starts with four of these values. So the Alma framework that represents the essence of a company. And I'm not sure if you know, Kiron, but Alma is the Portuguese and Spanish word for soul. So the idea is that actually while you apply the framework and the lessons we will learn with you that you share in your book, it can serve as a guide so you can really see the soul of your team.
I really like that analogy, Eduardo, because I've always said agility comes from within and our soul, of course, is within us. That's where agility comes from, not from without, not from the tools, the techniques, the practices that we follow.
That's what I believe too. So that's great. We are perfectly aligned. So within our soul, I propose us to work in four key agile values. So the first of one is accountability. And the key question for accountability is, do you know what you're accountable for? And for the Alma framework, it actually describes who is perceived as accountable. And what I propose is when you make that question to your team, it starts from the top. So you get answers like no one feels accountable. I feel that only the board feels accountable. The area management feels accountable. Until you cascade that down at people level, so through teams leadership and to people level. And the funny thing about accountability is that for me, it's much more than responsibility. It's much more than knowing what you do. It's about owning. It's about ownership. So accountability for me, and accountability for me as a concept in agility, is about ownership. And I know that in your book you might have a bunch of lessons learned based on that. Like just the first one here, like don't procrastinate, escalate, tells me a lot of that.
Absolutely. So when I was looking at this particular value and I was going through my book, I picked these particular three sections or chapters because I felt they all talk to this real concept of ownership. So the first one, don't procrastinate, escalate. Escalation is a powerful tool, which I find that some project managers use too much of it, some use too little of it. There are some project managers that feel they can solve the world's problems and they're going to hang on to that problem until it's well past the point where they can actually make a difference, and they should really escalate to a higher authority. It's the same when we're dealing with an agile team. If we have an agile lead, a scrum master, yes, we expect that they're going to be able to support the team in removing impediments, but they have to recognize when they're outside their sphere of control, and they need to be able to escalate to the appropriate power and influence that power or that authority to be able to take ownership of a problem and resolve it.
I certainly agree, and it's interesting that you brought that up. Like a lot of the companies that I work with and that come to me for advice, they are in that middle ground where they had a little thing and they want to escalate, right? And it's funny that regardless the size of the teams of the companies, they always have problems with escalation. They always like I've seen like teams that were little and needed to start, so they was still like stick to that concept that I own these, and and sometimes it's about the founders that do not want to let the cheese go, right? But I've also seen like some mid-size or big-size companies that have problems in structuring the escalation path, and I believe escalation path is something that is very simple but very underestimated within the companies, because when you make the rules of the game clear, the rules of engagement clear, is where you get value out of that, right?
Absolutely, and it's a great way that you stated that making the rules of engagement explicit. So Kanban, for example, talks about making your policies and your processes explicit. This is another example of that. Escalation, I think, has a bad connotation. It comes across as a bad word in some companies.
Exactly.
But if at the beginning of a project or at the beginning of a release, if we say, what are the circumstances under which it's reasonable for the team to escalate an issue or a blocker to a higher power, then everyone is working from the same set of rules. There isn't that perception that escalation is a bad thing or that the person is trying to just finger point that way. We're all going into it eyes open.
Exactly. And transparency is also one of the key things for agility, right? So even if we talk about the values that we propose, when we talk about accountability itself, if you do not know exactly what's your piece within the engine, right? What you really own within that engine, and giving that transparency through, like you'll not be able to really live agile, because you hit a limit where you really do not know uh, what the part that you want, because it's not clear to everyone, and
Right.
here's where the conflicts comes, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then the second article that I felt resonated with this theme or this value was the 5 signs of a self-managing team. Well, we all know that in Agile, we encourage the development of self-managing teams. And a part of that, though, is accountability. But the
Exactly.
accountability of a self-managing team comes from within, not from without. So it's not the negative aspect of accountability, which is, oh, if this team doesn't do a good job, I'm going to hold them accountable, which means that I get to punish them.
Finger pointing, right? Exactly. That's not what we're talking about here.
That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a team that collectively feels a sense of ownership for the work they're doing, both in terms of the value they're delivering to their customers, but also the quality of that work itself. It's that accountability towards also the transparency to maybe just making sure that they're not doing any hidden work. What they're doing is visible to stakeholders, that they're not cutting corners, that they're aligning with enterprise policies and standards. Those are all aspects of accountability that we want to see from a self-managing team. Because when we think about self-managing teams, especially in organizations that are moving towards agility, it's a very challenging situation because the companies, the leadership are somewhat hesitant about granting that degree of power and empowerment to the teams. And so if the teams don't demonstrate accountability, they're going to take away that ability to self-manage.
And it's exactly the other way around, right, Kiron? And I can like illustrate an example like that. Like I had some CTO one time asking me like, how can like I give trust, because accountability comes with trust, right? And we will see like further down when we discuss autonomy that uh, you really need to, it's a daily exercise, and you need to build that trust, that bond with little pieces every day. It's a daily exercise with your team to make them accountable, and to make them understand what is the part that they own, right? And
Correct.
making sure that they actually own that from within.
Exactly. And then the final article that I picked was one that talked about whether it's a project manager, whether it's a coach or a scrum master, they're hired to do a particular job. But sometimes there's that perception that they're going to have lots of time on their hands. So why don't they do additional work? And many times, if the scrum master or the agile lead happens to have come from a engineering side, they are used to, let's say, developing code or testing, there's that temptation, let me just roll up my sleeves and start to help the team. And I think it's very important that part of accountability is understanding what is one's primary responsibility and taking ownership for that. That is what we are going to be measured on. And while we can certainly do other things to help the team, if we spend too much time doing those other things, we could end up neglecting that first role that we have, that primary role we have. I always use the analogy of an orchestra. The project manager, for example, is the conductor of the orchestra. Now, that project manager or that conductor, they might be an expert at playing the violin, but you're never going to see a conductor jump down from the podium into the string section and start to play the violin with the people that are in that section of the orchestra. It would never happen. And so what we need to understand is when we're in this sort of an agile leadership role, part of our accountability is to take that big picture, to sort of
Exactly.
keep our eye on the big picture and not get ourselves sucked into the weeds. That's what all of our team members are there for. We need to be there to support them.
Exactly. And it's funny how many times we actually heard that question, right? Like even when I was working directly with projects, I always heard that question. So how many projects you can handle, right? How many projects you can handle more? And my answer was always like, okay, it depends. It depends on how much we enable the teams, how much we empower the teams to be able to self-manage. So, and it depends on the complexity of the project. So sometimes I will need to be more involved in a project if we cannot enable the team to go to that level. But my role here is much more about empowerment and enablement than within the project itself, right?
Absolutely. And if you dilute ownership too much, so if you make a project manager or a lead responsible for one initiative, then they are 100% accountable for the success of that. The moment you start to give them 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 initiatives to work with, now you're diluting that accountability and their ability to step up and actually achieve what they've taken on ownership for it's not really going to be there. And
Exactly.
unfortunately, I mean, as we get further in our careers, we get better at being able to judge how many projects of different levels of complexity can we take on at a time. But early in their careers, many project managers are very eager to
To show
succeed.
work.
They want to show their worth. And
Yeah.
so they'll say, yeah, sure, send more projects my way. And yet that's the surest path to failure.
Exactly. We also done that before, right? You know,
Absolutely. This is where I mean, as
this is where
much
we
as
learn it.
as much as you want to learn by reading good books, by taking courses, by hearing from mentors, many times we learn through the school of hard knocks that way by making mistakes.
Exactly. Exactly. That's great. That's great. So this takes us to the next value here, Kiran, that is learning. And the key question for learning is: do you think you're safe to fail? And in the Alma framework, he describes how learning is implemented. Uh, and we are talking here about much more profound things than, say, occasional training, cycle reviews, or reviews baked in the process. We're really talking here about establishing a learning culture, about psychological safety, about really setting the stage to have a team that can learn and have the space for that, right?
Absolutely. And I picked, I mean, I picked three of the articles that are in my book that talk directly towards learning. But psychological safety, if we pause on that for a moment, that's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I've written a couple of articles in the book related specifically to the importance and how, as a team leader, we can develop psychological safety within our teams. But the first one that I thought was directly connected to the concept of learning was how do we go about institutional learning? How do we leverage the knowledge from many, many different teams and translate that into organizational learning? And that talks to this idea of learning lessons from the past. One of the challenges which I encountered, and I'm sure you encountered as well, Eduardo, is you work with companies that they wait till the end of their project, they do a lessons learned session, they capture these lessons in a document somewhere, and they throw it into an archive. And no
Exactly.
one, no one ever looks at that ever again. So all that great
they,
knowledge.
they actually just do that for the sake of doing, right? They are following a process. And that's the thing.
Exactly, exactly. And so that's why it's important that we need to capture knowledge as we are running a process. But it's not just about identifying knowledge, it's about how do we share it. If we put it into a document, or even if we put it into a knowledge base, the expectation is someone's actually going to take the time to go and search for it. And everyone's really busy. They never will do that. And so that's where we need to get better at first categorizing and cleaning up our lessons to make them useful. There's that need to scrub them, to curate them. But then how do we go about sharing them? It's important to do things like, for example, establish communities of practice so that
Yep.
you can share them orally with your fellow practitioners. It's important about baking them into your playbooks or your standards. So that way it just becomes part of the job of doing business, of running your projects, versus putting them in some sort of a knowledge base and hoping that people are going to run across them that way.
Yeah, I had a leader ask me about that before, and he told me, how can I start learning kitchen? And what I told him is exactly that. So start yourself sharing a failure that you made and what you learned from there. So you can start giving space, and people will start seeing that they can fail too, and that they can share too with the others. So one thing that we did for that particular company is actually embedding the process itself, share community practices like sessions of sharing. So using the time that we had for the retros to do something that's much more beneficial for the team. Like today we are going to talk about databases and share, right? So creating spaces for sharing. I believe that's the key thing for a learning culture, right? And if you actually do not cannot like foster that within the teams, start from the top, start you sharing a learning that you made, a failure that you made, and what you learn with that.
I would agree. And as you mentioned about retrospectives, there's a lot of great ideas out there. about running good retrospectives, but some of the ones that I share are when you start to get in a team that has been working together for many months, retrospectives can start to become almost irrelevant. They start to become
Exactly.
stale. And so how do we go about continuing to get value from them? So, I mean, some of the ideas that I share in the book are things like you have to have psychological safety within the team for retrospectives to be valuable
Yep.
because people are not going to open up. They're not going to really share what they feel could make a difference if they don't feel safe. So that's the first thing. We need to make sure there's psychological safety to get value out of our retrospectives. Another thing that we need to get out of them is we need to make sure that we're being data driven. So rather than just say, oh, what do we think is going wrong or what do we think is going right, look at the data. What value have we delivered? How many defects have we had? What do our last customer surveys say? Let the data drive where we will focus our discussions. One of the challenges I find when we do retrospectives over and over again is the scope of the retrospective is too broad. It's like, think
Exactly.
about the last sprint, come up with stuff that could be
Yeah.
improved. Well, that's too broad. Focus it on a specific aspect of the team's delivery, and you might get better value out of it. And maybe the final thing I'll share around retrospectives
Uh-huh.
is we need to do retrospectives on our retrospectives. And I think that's something that we don't do enough of. After many of the
Retro of
teams
the
I've
retros.
retro on the retros. Many of the teams I've worked with, after a few months of delivering in an agile manner, I'll go and I'll ask them and I'll say, well, what do you hate the most about agile? And they'll say, I hate the ceremonies. And so that's why we need to retro our ceremonies as well
Exactly.
and figure out how can we make them more useful.
Yeah, and this is funny that you brought that up because, like, sometimes people always try to stick within the method. There's no better method. Again, if we use like discipline agile as a background here, there is the method or the process or whatever that works better for your situation, right? And I always tell, like, when people ask me, like, what's the best method, where to start? Start with something and improve from there. And you really do not need to follow all the ceremonies or you really need to see what sticks and what works best, right? So I got questions like, okay, let's what's the best? Let's start with Scrum or Kanban. I don't know. Let's see what's works best for your company and go from there, right? And sometimes it's even about drawing the process from scratch, and it works much better than following any of the methods, right? So we go back to old concepts like lean concepts as process drawing, value-driven approach, like things that we know and were there for years, but we kind of forgot about it when we start like following blind processes.
Exactly. That's absolutely key. I mean, the first step towards learning is to recognize that what worked for us before is not going to work for us in the future, and to leave ourselves open to learning new ways of doing things. That's why, to me, the most powerful sentence in the Agile Manifesto is that very first sentence: "We are uncovering better ways," and that's the
Exactly.
key. That's the key. There's no best way. We're always learning.
And people normally forgot about this first sentence here, right, Kiron?
You got it. You got it. And then the final article that I thought was very relevant to the concept of learning is it's a question that I'm always asked, whether it's in online communities or in the classes I teach.
This
It's
is a
how do you
great
go
question.
from being a leader in one industry to being a project manager or a leader in another? So I'm a construction project manager. I want to get into IT, or I'm a events manager. I want to get into marketing projects. How do I do that? And this goes more towards the concept of personal learning. And for many people, they look at learning as being, well, I just want to get things from a course. I want to pay money, go to a course and learn that way. Well, studies have shown that especially as you get older and older, as you get further in your career, only about 10% of learning a new skill comes from formal education. 90% is going to come from two sources. One is the relationship based
Yep.
learning that we get, basically the peer level learning or learning through a mentor or being coached. And 70% comes from experience, actually doing the work.
The
And
work,
so
yeah.
when we look at somebody that, let's say, is a construction project manager and they want to get into doing technology projects, that's fine. They can take a degree program or take some courses in IT, but that's not going to be enough. They need to
Yep.
look at finding a seasoned IT project manager as a mentor. And then they need to get some hands-on practice, maybe job shadow or volunteer and learn that way. That would be the best way to go about learning.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought that, Kiran, but because for me, project management is all about soft skills. So project management is not about learning SAP 5.1 to be able to deliver it. It's not about taking a course, even in Discipline Agile, right? Because if you do not have the experience, you do not even know what to do with the DA toolkit, right? So again, project management is all about soft skills, and as always, taught this way. And it's interesting here, and I'm going to illustrate some market differences that I've seen in my home country to here in North America. Like recruiters here, I believe that a majority of them still has this head of I need a project manager for SAP. I
Right.
need a project manager specifically for version XYZ of this
Correct.
software. And this is not right. It's not correct because a great project manager is not made of technical skills. It's made of great soft skills, right?
Exactly. Having said that, though, I mean, there is something to be said for you need sufficient domain
For
knowledge
sure.
to be effective, and that's why it was really great when many years ago PMI went from focusing on just general learning for recertification to the talent triangle, where
Yep.
one of the legs is that domain knowledge, because they recognize that even though the hard skills and the soft skills of project management, I mean, stakeholder engagement, building a schedule, managing a budget, those are portable to any domain. But if you know nothing about the domain that you're managing a project in,
To be
it's
much
going to
more
be
difficult for you.
it's much more difficult. It's hard to get that credibility with your stakeholders and with your team. It's very hard to be able to ask, as you said, the right questions. And so that's
Exactly.
we need to learn a certain amount, but it doesn't mean that we need to be an expert at it.
Exactly. And this is all about like uh, engaging and empowering teams, right? And people to do the job. I believe this is when you talk about a more agile concept or agile mindset, we are talking about that. Like the whole project manager is making sure that people are empowered and enabled to do the job and feel motivated about it, right?
Correct. A true servant leader.
Exactly. That's great. So this brings us to motivation. And the key question for motivation in the Alma framework, Kiron, is why are you doing this? And for the framework itself, it describes how and who follows the company vision. So it starts from the top. I'm not sure if there are companies out there that still do not have a vision, but certainly there are companies out there that do not know anything about what is to have a vision. But let's take it this way: zero, one. We have a vision somewhere, and I believe like at least from my experience, like, and if we talk in a more like modern concept, we talk about purpose and not vision anymore. But I know that there's a lot of companies out there that have many years, like companies with like 10, 15 years that wrote that vision or that purpose someday, I don't know, in their 30 years anniversary, and it stays there. No one reviews that, and people are really not engaged with it. And the main purpose of a vision of or a purpose itself is to be able to engage people, right? To be able to motivate people.
Absolutely. And that's where I'm a firm believer in what Daniel Pink writes about in his book Drive, that if you want to unleash intrinsic motivation, purpose is extremely important. And so many authors have written about that. Simon Sinek, start with why. I mean, what's the
Yeah,
reason that we want to know why? Well, it's about purpose, right? I
exactly.
mean, Lencioni and his writings talks about the importance of that as well. So looking through my book, I found 3 articles that I felt really tied to this concept of personal motivation. And the first one it's an article I wrote after I read Patrick Lencioni's book, 3 Signs of a Miserable Job. And
Uh-huh.
in that book, what Lencioni says is that how do we know that someone is not motivated? Well, there were 3 things that he pointed out. He said, do they feel irrelevant? Do they feel that their work can't be measured? He called it immeasurability. And do they feel that the work they do doesn't matter to anybody that way? And so this is where that really talks about the concept of purpose again. So as a project manager, we're in a really good position to be able to help people understand, why are we working on this project? How does what we're doing
Exactly.
contribute to the greater good, contribute to realizing the vision for our company? And an example of how we do that is maybe during your project kickoff, you bring the sponsor into the room to talk about the criticality of this project. What's the outcome? How is it going to benefit the company? How is it going to benefit this team member? That's how we start to create that sense of motivation, because otherwise
Exactly.
it's just a job. It's something that, yeah, I could do this, but I could do something a lot more interesting that way. So it's very important that as project managers, we need to recognize we may not have formal authority over our team members, but we're in a very good position to be able to help our team members start to see that what they're working on is going to make a difference, and to be able to show them the fruits of their labor, to show them an opportunity to illustrate the great work that they're doing. And that's one of the reasons why I really love agile approaches. Because if you think about a predictive approach to a project, a team member might work for months and months and months on a deliverable
Without seeing anything, right?
without
Yeah.
seeing results. And then when that deliverables done, maybe they're giving it to the next person in the value stream, but it's not
Exactly.
the customer. They don't see the connection to the customer. Whereas in an agile way, it's the short feedback loop. The work we do, we should see that feedback all the way to our customer fairly quickly, and we get that recognition. So for example, if we're following Scrum and we're doing a sprint review, that's a great opportunity for team members to see, here's the work I did over the past sprint, and getting that direct feedback from the stakeholders. Wow, that looks really
Exactly.
interesting. This is really going to help solve my business problem. That creates a lot of motivation.
And more than that, you know, what I've seen like in my career here with the companies is that you need to be able to link that value that you're delivering with your customer with the achievable goals of your team. So let's say, let's do a value-driven approach within a feature itself. So until we do not reach, let's say, 10% usability of that feature the way that we designed that, it doesn't end, right? So really tie the measurable UI goals or the measurable customer goals or client goals. When we talk about the concept of MBI, it's about that, right? So it's about being able to show the value and make sure that this value is perceived by the people who made it.
Exactly, exactly. The second article which I wrote is it's a very simple model that I proposed a few years ago for how do we get individual satisfaction and engagement and motivation from team members. And I called it the 3 C's model. So the first C is capacity, the second one is capability, and the third one, and this ties to motivation, is commitment, getting the commitment from our team members.
Uh-huh.
And one of the other aspects of commitment, which a project manager is able to address, is around recognition. Now, recognition, when we think about that in the workplace, many times we immediately think about, well, I'm going to get a bonus, or there's a trophy or an award of
Yep.
some kind. This is formal recognition.
Yep.
It's great. I mean, it's wonderful if a project manager has a budget to be
For
able
doing
to
that, yeah. But
for
it's not about, it's not about the numbers, right?
but it's not about the money. The book, The Carrot Principle, which Gostick wrote a few years ago, they provide 200 examples of ways of recognizing individuals that don't cost a cent. They've done studies that show that if a person is not recognized at least once a week, their motivation starts to come down. And it's very simple. I mean, it's things like being able to appreciate the individual as a unique individual. greeting them every day, getting to know them so you know when maybe something's not quite right, something's off, maybe they're a little bit down. Um, when the pandemic's over and we're working in person again, if you notice that they seem to be stressed, saying, hey, can I take you out for a coffee? Tell me what's going on. When they do something small that was meaningful, thanking them for it, saying thank you. These are all methods of recognition that are so powerful at helping to rekindle motivation.
Yeah, for sure. And I have a great story to share on that. Like when we engage at a personal level, I had a team member at a time that he was really demotivated for a bunch of situations in the project, and we know that we have a lot of that. Uh, but somewhat he was key for one of the pieces that we had on a technical standpoint of view. And he was really a great fan of badminton. But I didn't know nothing about badminton at that point. And what I did as a leader was understanding how badminton works, or at least start to understand a little bit to be able to have some starting point for a conversation with him, so I could get more closely to his universe. And I was able to get from there like a much more better individual that was able to deliver the promises. He started to get more engaged within the team because of that, because he was even other team members like that were not like interested in badminton, he was able to show how this works and people got interested. So it's about that, right? Getting about that personal level.
Absolutely. I mean, and again, it goes back to sort of that three signs of a miserable job, the concept of anonymity. If you as a leader view your people as a resource and one resource is the same as another, and you don't take the time to actually get to know them and understand them as unique human beings, in a way, you're not being inclusive. This is not a way of being inclusive because everyone has a story to tell. Everyone has something that they're great at. Take the time to understand that. Understand what makes them tick, what gets them excited, what are their hopes and dreams. If you have those conversations with your team members and you remember what you've heard, you can now have some powerful levers to be able to help to unleash that motivation.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. And before we get to engage remote team members here, Kiran, one of the things that I believe that most organizations also fails uh, is how to translate that purpose into achievable goals, and then into achievable uh, metrics or achievable pieces until you get that to the people level, right? So most organizations are okay. I have a vision or I have a purpose. It's clear for everyone. Great, everyone knows about that. But were you able to translate that goals to your team leadership? Where the team leadership was able to define the space for each individual about what they own and how this relates to that purposes, right? And I believe this is kind of key here for motivation. Majority of the organizations are, I don't know, in maximum three. And for really being able to unleash the motivation at a team personal level, you need to be able to understand how you translate that purpose into achievable goals, so team leadership knows what they need to go for, but also at a people level, how they contribute to that KPI or to that goal. Because I also do not believe in individual metrics because they can really be gamed very easily, right? So it's a team goal, but people need to know what is their part on that, right?
Absolutely. And that's where, unfortunately, too many times we see siloed metrics where there might be some high level objectives for the organization, but when those get cascaded down to the individual teams, you start to see individual KPIs at the team level that are actually in conflict with one
Yep.
another. And that's why frameworks such as OKRs, for example, are very powerful because that helps to create cross-organization alignment as well as traceability from the team level all the way up to the higher level purpose. The challenge is, like every other framework, The idea is solid, but the implementation is where failures occur.
Exactly.
For every company that does a good job implementing OKRs, there'll be 10 companies that fail at being able to do that. But yes, having that cascading of KPIs in a manner that creates organizational alignment is absolutely critical. And then the final article that I found that aligned with the concept of motivation is very, I would say, topical with the world we live in today. With
Exactly.
the pandemic, most of our teams are remote teams. We have dispersed team members. And if you've never worked with a group of people before and suddenly you're in a leadership position with this group of dispersed team members, how do you go about engaging them? Especially in a time like now when it's not just about working remotely, people are having their kids at home. Maybe their partner has lost their job. Maybe they're worried about a parent who might get sick because of COVID. How do you engage people so that they can get the job done, but they're also looking after themselves? And so some of the ideas that I share in the article are things like it's so important to have a meaningful kickoff. That kickoff meeting is your first best chance to start to create a sense of identity for the team, to start to get people to know one another. It's also really important to get good working agreements in place, develop those ground rules with the team, have them discover that, but take the time to do that. It's also really important that just because you're away from them, don't use that as an excuse to micromanage them.
Yep.
If you are
There's
working
a
with
fine line right between.
there's a fine line
Yeah.
there. Sometimes what happens is if we can't see those people every day, we might be tempted to start to micromanage them. And we don't want to do that. We want to give them outcomes that they're going to be trying to achieve, measure them based on the results, not on necessarily the effort they're putting in or are they online at a particular day or how quickly are they responding to an email. These to me are a byproduct. Focus on what is being achieved as a team that way. And I think it's also important that we take time to celebrate, to recognize, and to also understand that there are going to be challenges for everyone that's working in this remote mode. There's going to be days when somebody simply is not going to give you 100% because they have something else going on. Maybe a family member is sick. Maybe they have to pick up their kid from school early because the kid was coughing
Yep.
and they've been sent home. And we need to demonstrate that empathy
Yes.
and show that we see them as a human being with all the strengths and weaknesses that come with that. That's again how we're going to go about engaging or motivating them.
Exactly, and acknowledging that, right? That we have this problem, these problems, and it's common. Everyone has these problems, right? But how you show that empathy, how you show that care, is really how you make the difference here, right? And look, I had a conversation with Scott that was in Agility Talks too, Scott Ambler, and we were talking really about remote teams and the concept of remote teams and the discipline agile mindset or the agile mindset, and we came to the agreement that all these problems that we were talking about here were already out there, and what COVID really did is just enhancing that problems because we already
Absolutely.
had problems with alignment, we already had problems with like making sure that people are motivated before. Now these problems were much more enhanced, so we needed to deal more with them, right?
Absolutely. So, I mean, and I think I fully agree with that, that it's not that it's introduced necessarily a net new challenge. What it's done is it's taken existing challenges and potentially aggravated them. And that means that as project managers or as leaders of teams, we need to put that much more effort into actively listening, into demonstrating true empathy, into establishing psychological safety within our teams, into being that true servant leader. Because if we try to take that traditional command and control type approach with our teams in this time when they are so stressed out, they're just going to disengage. We're going to lose people.
Exactly. Exactly, and within a time like that, that like all the work is being done remotely, it's much easier for people to move positions too, right? So you need to acknowledge that and work to enable your team so they can actually feel motivated and they can produce more and then can feel more engaged and like you really start like producing better and better people this way.
Absolutely.
Great. So this brings us to the last value in the Alma framework, Kiron, that is autonomy. And the key question for autonomy is, do you think you have the necessary autonomy to do your job? And for the Alma framework, it describes who is trusted by the company to make decisions. So it's about decision making. It's about how much autonomy you give to your team members to be able to do their job. It's about making sure you're enabling them with the right tooling for doing their job. And it starts with no one, just the boss. And trust me, there are still organizations like that. And in a startup environment, I still see a lot of that. I see a lot of CTOs that really are behaving like they were the founders and they were coding, and that's okay. There's no problem with that. But now you need to scale up and think about how to scale up, right? So you need to start giving autonomy and building this trust bond between you and your team members, right? And then
Absolutely.
upper management only, our management, team leadership, and everyone. And when you talk about autonomy, there's always that discussion about, oh, if everyone can do everything. And autonomy is not about that. Autonomy is not about chaos. It's about making sure that people knows what is the piece that they own and have all the autonomy that they need to make sure that that piece works well, right? That piece of the engine works well. And autonomy also does not work well if you do not have all of the other values that I propose here in the Alma framework balanced, because you cannot have motivated teams if they do not have the autonomy to do the job. You cannot have autonomy if you do not have psychological safety, right? And the same thing about accountability. People will not feel accountable if you do not trust them to give autonomy to, right?
Exactly, and that's where the articles that I found for my book, they all really talk about. Two of them are on the topic of micromanagement, which is the opposite of autonomy, of giving true autonomy to a team.
Exactly.
And one of them is going to exactly that point that you spoke about, that it's not chaos, it's not a free for all. So the article on micromanagement, the first one, really talks about that as project managers, we're often under a lot of pressure. We're expected to deliver certain results. And even though we might want to provide flexibility to our teams in finding their ways of working, in giving them as much rope as they need to get the job done, the senior leaders that we're working with, they might be saying, I want you to drive results. I need you to make sure things are happening. And that's where sometimes I've worked with project managers, or I've mentored project managers that say, I don't want to micromanage, but my sponsor or my customer is making me micromanage the team. To me, I say that's a cop out. That is a
Exactly.
cop out when you do that. If we have the right people, and that's certainly, I would say, that's the caveat, assuming we have the right people and they are professional, and 95%, probably more than that, of the people I've worked with are professional, we shouldn't need to micromanage them. And
Exactly. And I believe it's also the role of a real agile leader to coach the your leadership too. Sometimes you need to raise the hand and say, okay, you want me to do that, but this is not how it works.
exactly, exactly. And that's where, even though we may find that we are at a lower point in power than, let's say, a functional manager or a customer or a sponsor, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't feel that we can push back. We should always be able to push back and say, hey, don't worry about it. I understand your need to understand, to be on top of what's going on. We're getting that information out of the team. We're going to get better results if we trust the team to get the job done. And so I never like to see team leaders, project managers put in a situation where they're saying, oh, I am behaving this way because I don't have a choice. To me, that's a sign of weak leadership. When a
Exactly.
leader says that, oh, I had to behave in this negative manner, but it wasn't my call, my hands were tied, they have abdicated their leadership responsibility by doing that.
Exactly. I agree 100%.
And then the third article, so jumping down to the third one, this talks about a situation that I've often run into where a project manager complains, I know that I'm doing a good job with the team. We're on top of what's going on, but my sponsor, my customer, insists on jumping into the weeds, and they're insisting on follow-ups every single day. and they want to roll up their sleeves and get in the mud with me. One of the reasons that that happens is that oftentimes people are put in a sponsorship role or they're acting as a project sponsor, but they don't actually know what the role of the sponsor is. Maybe they've never been a sponsor on a project
Exactly.
before. And that's why I think one of the most powerful things that we can do as a leader or as a project manager is at the beginning of the project, have a one-on-one meeting with the sponsor and establish the rules of engagement with them to say, what's your role? What's my role? What do you expect of me? What do I
Exactly.
expect of you? And if you establish those boundaries, you're less likely to find yourself in a situation where the sponsor is overstepping their boundaries.
Yeah, and remember me about a situation here. Like I was given a kickoff deck to a review for one of the companies here, and it's amazing how we underestimate that very in the beginning of project lesson that we had in our lives, like roles and responsibilities, right? Every kickoff deck needs to have a slide talking about that so we can set the rules of engagement, right? It's important for everyone to know what's the expected roles so we can discuss about that and change that if needed, right? But people often uh, misinterpret that like, okay, it's a tough rule, it's a tough role. I do not want to put people in a situation that they do not like to be. It's not about that. It's about making the rules of the game clear so everyone can contribute, right?
Exactly. And I think on top of that, the other thing that we need to understand is sponsors are going to require, or customers rather, whether it's sponsors, customers, senior leaders, they're going to need information. And if they're not getting the information in an accurate, complete manner, they're going to find information another way. They're going to
Yep.
be following up with the team members directly, or they're going to be bugging you 3 times a day to get the information. To me, that says that's a failure in communication planning. We need
Yep.
to have met with that sponsor to say, what are your information needs? How frequently do you need to be kept in the loop? What type of information do you require? And then making sure that we have information radiators or we have other means of getting them the information that they need and that we work with the team to make sure that that information is kept up to date. This goes really to that whole concept of self-managing teams. They want to be left alone to do their own thing. But if they're not keeping, let's say, their work boards up to date, if their Scrum boards or their
Exactly.
Kanban boards are out of date, then their sponsors and their customers are going to be chasing them down to get updates.
Exactly, and I believe you touched a point here. Like sometimes we still like enter in that discussion about engineering. It's kind of a black box that we have our way of working here, and we cannot like be uh, annoyed by any other things in between. So uh, I believe that this is not true. I believe this is kind of a counter agile way of working, right? Because when you actually give transparency to your process, when everyone know what you are doing, the way that you are doing, and it's clear to everyone how this works, the less people will bug to know what the status of the thing. So if you need to have a Kanban board with 15 statuses, do it. And then as the people get more mature in understanding what's happening, you can start taking out, right? So this is also like basics of process drawing. You start with what you have, with the most comprehensive way that you see things, and then you can start taking things out as you see they're not useful. So majority of the times I still see this kind of like problems that are tied to like more basic concepts in process drawing and things like that. That okay, let's be clear. Like transparency is a key. It's really key in agility. And if you still want to have teams that works in black boxes, you're not willing to go to agility or even start working anything in this matter. So you should be working waterfall.
Exactly, you got it. And that's what it really ties to the second article that I highlighted, which is that we want teams that are self-managing, but we have to recognize that unless you're working in a startup, if you're in a mid-sized organization, a large organization, there are going to be rules, there are going to be standards,
Exactly.
there are going to be policies. And the standards and policies are not there to punish the team. They're there to keep the team and the organization safe.
Yep.
And so that's where I really like the term that Disciplined Agile uses, which is semi-autonomous self-managing
Yep.
teams. So we're saying they're self-managing, but we're giving them autonomy within the constraints of the organization's policies and standards. The concept of lean governance really aligns well with this. The concept of aligning with enterprise roadmaps, taking advantage of enterprise assets, reusing those assets, contributing to them. These are all ways in which a team can still be self-managing, but there are going to be certain rules and regulations they need to follow. And that's one of the ways in which agility will become sustainable. Because if we have a team that is claiming to be agile, they're delivering quickly, the product quality is good, but they're breaking the organization's rules, or worse, breaking some industry regulations, they're going to give agility a bad name. Agile transformation is going to get shut down very, very quickly.
Very quickly, yeah. I agree with you. Well, so great. You share a lot of lessons learned here on your book that really relates to the key agile values that are proposed in the Alma framework. So I just have to thank you for being here at the show. Uh, these things align very well, and I believe we will have a some lucky winners. I believe we are going to make 2 giveaways very soon, right? Yeah,
Correct.
that we would love to read your book. For people that want to win our giveaways, go to Amazon, get Kiron's book,
His interior difficulty practice.
and certainly you will benefit a lot from this a long-standing professional career that Kiron has, and he's willing to share, and he's generally sharing with us here in Agility Talks today. So again, thanks a lot, Kiron. It was great talking with you today.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Eduardo. I really appreciate it.